Hey everyone, today's topic is MLA format. We're going to be talking about that. I'm going to be telling you what it is, how to use it, what the rules are about it, because this paper that you're going to be turning in pretty soon actually has to be formatted according to the rules of MLA format. But first of all, what is MLA? What does it mean? Well, it actually stands for Modern Language Association. Basically, a bunch of scholars got together and said we would like some uniformity in how people are submitting papers in the fields of the humanities. Okay, this is specifically for the humanities that created this. And they wanted all the papers to abide by the same rules when they were submitted for publication. This also affects you because as a student you are in academia, and academia adopted the same rules. So even though you're not submitting your papers for publication, you're still submitting them in an academic environment. So you need to get used to those rules basically. MLA is not the only format. There are other formats, and depending on what field you will be studying, they might be different. For example, I studied MLA format when I was working on my bachelor's degree because I was an English student, which is part of the humanities. But when I worked on my master's degree, I had to learn APA, which is the American Psychological Association, and they have their own rules for how papers are supposed to look and be put together. So I had to relearn all of that information for that. It just depends on what you're studying. A lot of the essays you'll be writing for college as an undergrad, probably most of them are going to be MLA. That seems to be pretty accepted. That was my case when I was a student. Most teachers would just ask for MLA format. So what does adhering to MLA format mean to you as a student? It's actually a lot easier than it sounds. It's not scary, believe me. All it means is there are some specific rules about how your paper should look, okay? And I'm talking about the really finer details like the font that you use and the spacing that you use and the size of the margins. All of this stuff has to do with MLA. Remember, it all comes down to uniformity. MLA wants all papers to look the same way so that you can forget about having to worry about that stuff and just read the paper for the information that's inside, which is what really matters. So MLA helps the reader to forget about all that other stuff and focus on the content. Now, I've uploaded a sample research paper. You will find it in Canvas. I'm going to put it under whatever week we're in right now. At the moment I can't think of what it is, but go to the most recent week and it'll be there waiting for you, all right? And I'm going to go through this with you. I want to show you a close-up view of what a paper looks like. We're only going to be looking at the front page, okay? Because for this first essay, that's all I'm concerned with. There are other rules of MLA that affect the rest of your essay, but we're not going to worry about that yet. And I mean like integrating quotes and giving sources where you got your information from. MLA also has some rules about that, but we're not there yet. So for now, we're just going to look at the first page, just the first page of this essay, and that's what I'll be looking for in your paper. So let's do that. Let's go through this and see how this thing looks. All right, so here we have a sample paper. This is the same paper that I'm uploading for you guys to be able to look at. This is a really good resource, by the way. There's nothing wrong with taking your essay and comparing it to this if you get stuck on something. It's a really nice visual model of exactly what MLA format looks like and what your essay should look like. So let's talk about some of the more important elements of how this essay is set up. A lot of it all has to do with visually. How does this thing look? All right. Notice the margins, for example. The margins are 1 inch on every side, okay? This is 1 inch, and this is 1 inch, and this is supposed to be 1 inch. It looks like it formatted a little bit odd. And the right side gets cut off here, unfortunately, but that is 1 inch, going all the way from the left to the right there, okay? 1 inch margins is very important. And your teachers know what 1 inch looks like. Sometimes students will make it 1.5 inches because by doing that, you squeeze the text together and you get more pages out of it. So if your teacher was asking for 5 pages and you have 4.25 pages, changing the margins can squeeze it into 5 pages. But I want you to understand something. Your teachers know when you do that. So don't do it. It's actually really obvious. 1 inch is very different from 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches. So don't try to make the essay look like more than it is by changing the margins. MLA format is very specific in that it's got to be 1 inch. Now, there is one caveat to that rule, and that's this guy right here. What is that? Well, it says student 1. But for your purposes, it's your last name and the page number, okay? So they put student because this guy's name is Joe Student. You're going to put your last name and then a space, and then the page number. And this thing here goes on every single page. Every one, regardless of what's on the page, has to have your last name and a space and then the page number. If you notice I keep saying and a space, it's because I've noticed some students will squeeze the name and the page number against each other so that there's no space in between, and it may seem very picky, but that is wrong. That is not MLA format. That's how picky MLA format actually is. So make sure you got that space going between there, okay? Now, as far as the spacing there, this between the top of the page and where that name and page number occur is actually 1/2 inch. That's the one place where it's not 1 inch. Everything else everywhere is 1 inch margins, but that one piece is 1/2 inch. It's still 1 inch from the right side. That's still 1 inch going to the right side of the page, but going from the top, it's 1/2 inch. If you're wondering how to do that, the easiest way is if you're using Word, and most of you are, you can just go into the header. Double click at the top of the page and it'll open up a header. And then I believe, I don't use Microsoft very much or Word, but I believe it says you can click on Insert and it'll give you the option to put name and page number. You click on that and then you type your name there and it'll automatically put it on every page. And probably it's already going to be set up as a default for 1/2 inch. If it's not, then you can change that on your own. But do make sure it's 1/2 inch, okay? 1/2 inch from the top. So that's your last name. That's the page number. So the successive, like for instance, let's look at the next page here. Student 2, right? The last name stays the same, but now we're on page 2. Now we're on page 3. Now we're on page 4. Everything gets the same thing. That's the one thing that shows up on every page, okay? The rest of the stuff I'm showing you shows up on page 1, and that's this guy here. All of that info right there. Let's talk about that. The first thing that shows up is your name. Now, don't put last name first because that's not MLA format. Whatever your name is, normally put it that way. I would put Dan Wheeler. I'm not going to put Wheeler, comma Dan because that's incorrect. It's got to be first name first, last name last. Joe Student. Next is your teacher's name. And I'm not going to be too picky about how you write that down, okay? If you want to put Professor Wheeler, if you want to put Mr. Wheeler, if you just want to put Wheeler, I honestly don't care. As long as you've got your teacher's name there, you're good. You took care of it. That's the second level there. The third level is the name of the class. And believe it or not, I've had students get this wrong. Our class is English 1A, okay? Just call it English 1A. I think what happens is sometimes I'll get students who recycled essays from other classes and they forgot to change it. So it'll say Anthropology 1 right there, kind of a dead giveaway that you wrote that essay for someone else. So don't do that. Make sure you put English 1A. It's for this class, right? Finally, the fourth level, and this a lot of people get wrong. In fact, amazingly, people continue to get it wrong for the entire semester. And I don't understand why, because I feel like I'm explaining it pretty clearly, but look, here's the thing. The date's a little bit different. This is British format, okay? In Britain, Great Britain, if you go to any of those areas, they're going to put the day and then the month and then the year. It's different in America. For some reason, we got in the habit of putting the month and then the day and then the year, which British people think is totally backwards, and I kind of get that, because why not start small and work your way up to bigger, right? Day, month, year. That's how it's got to be. Don't play with that. 13 January 2014 is when this thing was submitted, okay? 13, not 13th. There's no TH there. It's just the number 13. January is spelled out. Don't put Jan period, okay, or Jan. Spell out the entire month and then put the year, okay? There are no commas. There's no punctuation at all because it's not necessary. If you were putting it in American version, January 13th, 2014, you would have a comma after the 13 because you've got two numbers there and you need to separate them. But MLA Format does away with that. Because it uses British format, you do not need a comma there. Now, I really want to make it clear that this is the only acceptable way to write your date. Anything else you do, if you put just numbers like 1/13/14, that is not MLA, and you're going to lose a couple of points just because of that. These are really easy points to get. There's a section. We're going to talk about how the papers are going to be graded because I use a rubric. And there's one section of the rubric that is just looking at how you formatted your paper. If your paper looks just like this, your front page, you got all the points. And that's a great way to boost your grade. But you'd be surprised how many people screw up on this little bit of information right here. So, okay, we talked about the name and the page number in the upper right. By the way, this stuff here, this only appears on page 1, okay? Notice the other pages, nothing. There's no name, no first name, last name, no date, no teacher, no class. You don't need it anymore. You only need it on the first page because that's the first page your reader sees, and that's the information they want to see, but they don't need to keep seeing it, okay? This is different. Your last name and your page number, because you're reminding your reader, this is still my paper, and I want you to be aware of what page you're on. Also, if these were stapled together, for example, if you were turning in a hard copy and the staple came out and they got separated, that would help the instructor put it back together. Believe it or not, that's part of the reason why it's there. So, let's talk about the title. And I think we're going to talk about titles a little bit more in the next week because they really are important. We're going to talk about how important they are. But for now, let's just talk about how you format them. Notice it's centered, okay? That's the one thing that gets centered. Only titles. So that means you have equal space on this side and equal space on this side. Don't eyeball it. And here's what I mean by that. Don't start at the left side and then just keep hitting the space bar until you think you've got it centered, because your eyeball might be wrong. The computer will do it for you. If you're on an Apple computer, you can just hit Command-C, Command and the letter C, and it'll automatically do it. I know there's a shortcut for Word, but I don't remember what it is. But it has one too. There's also just a button in the toolbar that helps you justify left or justify right or justify center. For this one line, you justify center, okay? So this title should be in the direct center. Now, speaking of the title, I want you to notice the spacing on this. Double spacing. Double spacing is the only correct spacing for a college paper in MLA format, okay? Everything, and I really mean everything, is double spaced. The spacing from here to here was double spaced. That's double spaced. That was double spaced. From here to your title is double spaced. A lot of people want to put an extra space right here because they think it looks nice. It doesn't matter if it looks nice. It's not MLA format. MLA format means you set your computer up for double spaced and you hit return or enter one time, and that's double spaced. Now, if you're wondering how to set up double spacing, do set up double spacing, by the way. Let the computer do the work. Otherwise, it's going to make so much work for you. I have had students who will be typing along and then when they get to the end, they hit return twice, and that makes a double space. Well, you don't want to do that, because if you manually create double space between each line, when you go back to make an edit, let's say you insert a couple of words right here, it's going to shift everything over to the right just a little bit, including that double space that you put in there, and everything's going to have this weird shifted, slanted, diagonal look. It's going to be a mess, and you will have to manually go through and erase all those extra spaces in there. It's going to look really weird. There's a very easy way around that. Just tell the computer to do it double spaced. You don't have to write it double spaced. If you want to write single spaced for whatever reason, that's what works for you, that's okay. But it means you're going to have to highlight the whole page later on and then tell it double space this, okay? If you're working on a Mac, an Apple, an iPad, something like that, you can just hit Command and the number 2, and that tells it double spaced. It'll set up that way. The default is single spaced, okay? Every time you bring up a word processor, it's always going to start out single spaced unless you change that. So you will probably need to tell it you want this to be double spaced. And just as a reminder, everything is double spaced. Even from here to here, from your title to your first sentence is double spaced. Notice there's no extra space between the paragraphs. Do not hit enter twice because you want more space there. I realize it makes it easier to fill up those pages, but it's not MLA format. There should be no space there. Now, to be fair, I think Word does this and some other word processors. They, as a default, will automatically put just a little bit of extra space between paragraphs. If yours does that, don't freak out. I'm not going to hold that against you. I can tell when the computer did it, and I can tell when you did it. If the computer did it, it's okay. It's not MLA format, but I'm not going to hold it against you that Microsoft thinks that looks nice for some reason, okay? But don't purposely hit enter twice to put extra space between those two paragraphs. So that's spacing. Let's talk about the font. I only want one font, okay? Times or Times New Roman, which are essentially the same thing. If it's Times or if it's Times New Roman, you're good. This paper right here is typed in Times New Roman. I realize there are a couple of other acceptable alternatives for MLA. I think Arial might be acceptable, and I think Courier might be acceptable. But for our class, and I think you should consider for future classes, Times New Roman is always acceptable, okay? And this is mostly what papers get submitted in. So I want to suggest that you get used to using it. And for our class, it has to be. If you don't use Times or Times New Roman, you're going to lose a point for that too. And that's just silly because that's such an easy point to keep. Just use the correct font. Every word processor has it. Every single one of them, I promise you. You're not going to have trouble finding Times. The size of the font is 12 point. Don't go less and don't go more. People will sometimes go more. Sometimes people will try 14 because, again, it fills up more pages and it makes it look like you've made more than you actually have. I know the difference between 12-point font and 14-point font. So if you try to make it a bigger font, I can tell, and there's another point you're going to lose because it's not MLA format. It has to be 12-point, okay? Really important. So that's pretty much it. That's the introduction for MLA format. Again, remember, we're going to talk a little bit more about it as the semester goes on. There are other things we'll be talking about that are affected by MLA format. We're not there yet. We're easing our way into it, okay? So let's talk about this essay. If you've been keeping up with the workload, and to be fair, I think it's a pretty light workload. We've been doing this in very small chunks, okay? We've done one step at a time, and you've had a day or two each time, each step of the way. Hopefully you're caught up. Hopefully you're keeping up with what we've been doing. If you have, the good news is you're practically done with the essay. That's it, okay? We started with the body paragraphs, remember. That was the first thing I told you to do, and that was telling the story. The beginning of the story, the middle of the story, and the end of the story. Then we worked on the introduction, and we talked about how the structure of that, I want to see your thesis statement right there at the bottom of the introduction. And we also talked about what goes into that thesis statement. Remember, answering those 3 questions. I'm specifically looking for those 3 elements in that thesis statement. Who, what, and why is this significant? Please remember that part. It's not why did it happen. I don't care about why it happened. I care about why it's important. So if there was a lesson learned, put that in there, right in the thesis statement, okay? I gave you an example of mine a couple videos back. Go back and watch that if you're getting stuck on this part. We talked about that very first sentence, a badass sentence, right? You got these badass methods of starting an introduction. All of them are legitimate and all of them are great ways to start a paragraph, to start that introductory paragraph. And then we talked about how the information gets more focused, more condensed until you get really specific, which is the thesis statement. Then we spent a couple of days just on the conclusion. We talked about that as well. Remember, it goes from narrow to wide. So if you want to restate the main idea right there, you can do that. And then go wider and wider and wider. And remember, the conclusion is telling us, it's telling your reader, this is important, and it's explaining why. Why is this important? Why should the reader care? We'll tell them, explicitly tell them why they should care. This is important because, and you fill in the blank there, okay? Really important. That's what a conclusion does. Keep in mind, however, that in the conclusion, you don't add extra information. I know there's a great temptation to do that because while you're writing this is the last paragraph you're writing, and sometimes an idea will come to you. Oh God, what a great idea. Why didn't I say that? Oh, I'm going to put it right here. Don't do that. Because if it's part of your argument, in this case, if it's part of your story, then it belongs in those 3 paragraphs, those body paragraphs, not in the conclusion. That is not the story. So, one other thing I want to mention. Don't tell me the story in the introduction. I can't tell you how many students will do that. They're so anxious to tell the story that they'll just go right in. Well, Jerry had an appendicitis and he almost lost his life and blah, blah, blah. Well, don't tell me that. That doesn't belong there because this is where the story is, okay? You're setting up the story, but you're not telling the story. So do not tell the story. Don't give away the secret before you get to the actual story, which is these 3 right here. You're only introducing the story, okay? Don't tell me what the story is.